All right, so some of those things that can impact the embryo is things that we would call stressors. We also probably referred to these, I have in the past, as mutagens, which are things that can cause mutation. So smoking, drugs, inadequate nutrition, alcohol, um, overnutrition. There's a lot of things here that can add to this, right? The intrauterine area of within the uterus basically is a poor kind of environment and predisposes the person to developing specific diseases later on in life. So again, this is essentially keeping in good health and kind of that balanced diet and stuff like that is necessary during this time period. Um, Deciduous dentation is an interesting one. Deciduous basically means, that it's seasonal, essentially. If you think about trees, deciduous trees lose their leaves in the winter. Essentially, that's what same thing happens with dentition, which is childhood teeth fall out, and we get our what's called adult teeth or permanent teeth. And this happens kind of post weaning. And again, it's that the baby teeth are used for the first stage of food intake, and then we have kind of adult teeth moving into the final stages. Menarche is when menses starts or female menstruation first starts. This is the beginning of that part of puberty for biologically females. Um, Also, there is sexual dimorphism. I don't know how much we've talked about sexual dimorphism. It is the size difference between males and females by definition. When we get into primates and things like silverback gorillas, there's a distinct difference between sexual dimorphism. And even in humans, males tend to be bigger than females. Growth during puberty is a unique thing among humans. The idea of growth spurts are very unique and interesting to human beings. It's not just like this gradual thing. Sometimes people can grow as much as 6 inches in a year or even 6 months. It's a fascinating thing. And it has a lot to do with epiphysis, which is the growth centers. These are the areas of your body that stretch out. Cartilage that then turns into bone post-puberty and hardens, and you kind of then you're solidified in your height and stature. But yeah, very fascinating kind of things around human biology in terms of puberty growth. Adulthood and aging, again, begins with the completion of puberty in terms of aging out and the fusion of the epiphyseal kind of regions. Heightened development related to environment. There is a gradual trend of getting taller in rural areas and then move towards city. It's reduced heights, which is fascinating. It may be that protein sources are more readily available in the rural areas. And there's also, my example with the Korean population probably is good for this as well. So again, height on average is moving up. It's trending up. I know that when I was a kid, I think average height for males was 5'8". And it has kind of moved more up to 5'10". In different locations, if you're in the Netherlands, I think average height for males is something like 6'4". And they might be the tallest in the world. So it just depends on location. DNA, again, genetic drift over time, those changes, and then also nutrition levels. Aging, becoming older, cultural behaviors and biological stuff around that. We have kind of pictures on this slide here of what normal bone looks like and then what osteoporosis looks like. So that's one of those things with age is kind of calcium uptake and or efficiency of calcium uptake becomes an issue as we get older. And this is just part of the aging process. Bones become more brittle. They're less durable. They're not as good at holding muscle. But this would be one of the reasons to continue to exercise, because as you use bones and as you use muscle, they tend to maintain their strength. It's when we stop using them that they tend to start to deteriorate. And then I've kind of talked about this already with biological changes later in life. The reduction of homeostasis, right, is the idea of organisms' maintenance of internal environment that starts to shift as we age. Essentially, the Earth, provides life, and oxygen is required for us to breathe and whatnot. But oxygen also starts to break us down. Oxidation is essentially one of those things that happens to everybody, but it happens to metal and everything else. It starts to become kind of this corrosive, almost uh, you know, degrading kind of thing that happens biologically. Menopause is also associated with adulthood and aging. So menarche is the beginning of menses, and then the ceasing of menses is basically menopause as females age. Strategies for survival and reproduction. Obviously, the way that humans acquire food and reproduce within the context of culture and society. So this can get into things like sexual selection. But again, also some fascinating things happen around female biology in particular, which is groups, hunter-gatherer groups, and say the subarctic regions of Canada. It's a fascinating thing is that women would basically have babies all at the same time within the tribal groups. And the reason being is that in the summer, late fall, they would essentially do a large caribou hunt, and they would slaughter a lot of animals all at the same time, and they would gorge themselves really on caribou fat and meat when they were doing that. And then they would kind of ration out. It would be a festival, and then they would ration out their meat supplies for the winter. Well, that harvesting of meat product and animal fat would give women a bump in progesterone levels, because fats and having higher fat levels in women is required to have a balance between progesterone and estrogen, which enables women to get pregnant at higher rates of efficiency. So essentially, these women in these subarctic regions would all give birth at the same time, because they all would up their progesterone levels and kind of estrogen levels to this maximum kind of potential, and then they would basically be able to get pregnant during that time period. Other time periods, obviously, they would have been doing a lot of work, and their progesterone levels would have been lower. So this becomes one of those things with food acquisition also relating to human reproduction and childbirth. Prolonged childhood. This was another thing that would happen. A lot of women in tribal level groups or even band level groups would have nursed their children up to age 3 and 4. This also reduces progesterone levels, so a lot of times women are not able to get pregnant as efficiently as they would if they weren't breastfeeding. So postmenopausal women in childcare, this is a fascinating one too. A lot of questions around menopause. There's a lot of animals don't have this structure of kind of life cycle that we do. I know that whales do. Also, menopause is looked at. Current research is saying that the goal here is that so that women, when they get older, are not concerned about childbirth and are concerned with taking care of and or being community members for the others that are there. Essentially forming kind of this other level of not only babysitting, but also cultural kind of cohesion in a sense. So there's some fascinating things around this, and if anybody's interested, it's one of those things that's getting a lot of attention in terms of the function of like grandparents or whatnot. And this is around kind of postmenopausal women, but there's also some great studies on whales as they age out and what their kind of relationship is to the pods and whatnot. Genetic development and acclimatization and cultural adaptation. So there's some interesting things that happen here. High altitude stuff. And again, you may want to research the high altitude things around oxygen and hemoglobin, but just kind of a quick rundown. Many people who live at high altitude, whether it be in the Himalayas or the Andes in South America, they have their hemoglobin or their red blood cells are able to uptake more oxygen. Also, one of the other physical things that happens to them is they become barrel chested, and they do this because their lungs actually are bigger, trying to take in more oxygen. And it's a fascinating thing. It's a biological adaptation, in a sense. I would say the cultural adaptation is things like in Peru and Bolivia, when there's a lot of people at 13,000 feet constantly. Many times people chew coca leaves or drink a lot of coffee, and it's in order to stay stimulated. So if your heart's beating faster, then you're uptaking more oxygen to your brain. You don't get altitude sickness. So there's some genetic and or biological adaptation, but there's also cultural adaptation in terms of environment and or food sources. Functional adaptation is the biological changes that occur during the individual's lifetime, increasing individuals' fitness. And remember, we talk about fitness, we're talking about capability of successful reproduction, right? So again, biological changes that happen during individual's lifetime can be things like puberty, right? Also, lack of triggering maybe some of those genetic disorders that you could be harboring inside your DNA. Some of those things would also be included in this fitness structure. All adaptations serve to maintain an internal homeostasis, so that's the thing as well, right? Remember, the internal body, the goal here is to adapt. And one of the things that a lot of people know, they've heard it, but maybe they don't fully understand, is that we have essentially cancer cells going in our body all the time. It's whether or not our body cuts them out and gets rid of them and disposes of them before they start to form tumors, right, and become permanent. And then we have to use kind of drugs and or Western chemotherapy or alternative stuff, immunotherapy, some of those other things. So essentially, your body will adapt, right? But it also requires proper nutrition and some of these other things to be able to adapt and or fix those things that pop up that we're not necessarily intending to have happen to us. All right, so in terms of climate adaptations, climate adaptation, obviously the human condition, we now are able to produce clothing. Over time, we didn't need as much hair, and it's because we started to produce clothing in these different locations. But the human body is able to adapt pretty well. So climate adaptation, homeothermic organisms' ability to maintain constant body temperature. Again, ours is usually kind of in this 98.6 region, but I just read an article that it seems to, our body temperature seems to be dropping. This is a fascinating kind of biological adaptation. We'll have to see how that's correlated. It would make sense if it was dropping if temperatures are rising around the Earth and we're kind of adapting to that. Vasodilation is increase in blood vessel diameter due to nerve, and this could be from drugs and or heat. So your veins essentially dilate to let more blood flow through, so that essentially you can kind of get rid of those things like through sweat and some of these other things. Hypothermia or hyperthermia, sorry, is too hot. Body functions basically stop at 104 degrees to 107. And if you've ever had an extreme fever or something like that, you know that this is like majorly painful and your body doesn't like it. Remember, homeostasis is kind of that internal body structure. Sweating is one of those things that humans have, able to cool ourselves off. Animals like pigs don't have the ability, so they need kind of water holes or whatnot. So it's a fascinating kind of piece as well. Sweating is definitely a cooling aspect. It gives us a major advantage when doing long distance endurance stuff. Sweating is key to that. Some people say this, I don't know how long, some people take longer, but 10 to 14 days for somebody to fully adapt to a hot climate. So again, essentially our bodies will start to adapt to this, and this is remarkable that our bodies are able to do this, to be honest. Body shape and heat stress. Bergman's rule is basically smaller bodies are better adjusted for heat, and larger bodies for cold. We're not talking about height here, we're talking about size. Smaller bodies adjusted for heat, larger bodies for cold. Allen's rule is that animals' limbs are longer in hot weather and shorter in cold environments. So again, this would be shorter individuals are able to pump blood maybe in colder environments to heat them up if you're smaller, and then you're able to cool off more, vasodilation basically in these warmer temperatures. Hypothermia, is body temperature falls below workable temperature, and this is vasoconstriction, where your blood vessels basically in diameter they decrease. Vasometallic rate, in which the organism's body, while at rest, expends energy to maintain basic bodily function. Amount of heat given off per kilo of body weight. Okay, so this is the basometallic metabolic rate. It helps with